Welcome back to our study of apologetics. This is our second session, and in this session, we're going to look a little bit more at Acts chapter 17 and the way that Paul speaks about God to the Athenians at Mars Hill. And then we're also going to talk about whether or not all people know God, and if so, what do they know about God? How do they respond to that knowledge? And what does that mean about why we might need arguments for the existence of God? So, if I'm not mistaken, we finished last time kind of dipping our toes into Acts 17 and Paul's time in Athens, where he saw all the idols, he saw the altar they had to the unknown God. And we mentioned briefly how Paul got to know his audience. He interacted with the people in the marketplace and with the Jews in the synagogue and whatnot. And then when he was invited to speak at Mars Hill at the Areopagus, he began by making a connection with them, by building a bridge, by telling them that he had noticed that they were a very religious people. And then he talks about that altar to the unknown God that he had noticed and says that he's there to tell them who that unknown God is. So there's a few more things that I want us to notice. There's a lot we're not going to dig into for the sake of time, but there's a few more things I want us to notice about the way Paul engages in this apologetic act, right? This apologetic moment in Acts 17. So one of the things he says, this is picking it up in verse 24 of Acts 17, he says, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." So he doesn't start with God's promises to Abraham. He doesn't start with, Jesus is the Messiah. He doesn't start with the same categories and in the same places as he does when he speaks to Jews in the synagogue. So if you compare Acts 17 to Acts 13, where in Acts 13, Paul is preaching to Jews in the synagogue, he can talk about things from the Old Testament that his audience will know and be familiar with. And then he can tie those things in to Jesus and say, Jesus is the one we were waiting for. Jesus is the promised one. He can't do that with the Greeks because they don't know about Abraham. They don't know about David. They don't know about messianic prophecy and all those kinds of things. So instead, he starts simply with God. He starts with their recognition that there's an unknown God out there, a God that they may have missed, a God that they don't know. And he says, I'm going to tell you about that God, and here's who that God is. That God is the creator of heaven and earth, the creator of mankind, the creator of everything. And since he's the creator of everything, he doesn't need anything. He doesn't need us to build him a temple. He doesn't need us to offer him sacrifices, all those kinds of things. And then he moves to their own thoughts and culture, draws out some things that they've gotten right that are true, and then I want you to notice what he does with these. So he's talking about the God who created everything, and then at the end of verse 27 and then into verse 28, it says about this God, "Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for," and then there's a quote, "in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said," and there's another quote, "for we are indeed his offspring." What Paul appears to be doing here is quoting from two different Greek authors. And you may have a note in your Bible, like I do, that gives some idea of where these quotes might have come from. And when he's quoting these poets or Greek writers, he is affirming that what they have said about God is true, that what they've said about God is right. So one of the things Paul is doing is he's using what is true in their own culture, in their own thoughts, and using that to help them think rightly about God. And we can do the same thing today, right? We don't have to use only the Bible to connect to people and help them begin to think about God. Now, we are going to need to get to what the Bible says, and we're going to be working from the assumption that we know the Bible, right? And we're trying to help people to come to believe the things that are in the Bible. But we might be in a conversation with someone who doesn't know the Bible, doesn't care about the Bible. The Bible is not an authority for them that they recognize, right? It would be like quoting the Bible to the Greeks. They might say, well, that's nice for you, but I don't care. I don't believe that. How do you engage somebody like that and help them? Well, one of the things we can do, one of the things that Paul does, is use things that they recognize, that they know, that are true. Right? So, for example, you might say, you know, that song that talks about how lonely everybody is and how we feel like we're made for something more, but we never can quite seem to grasp whatever that is, and the world is just so broken and there's so much sadness. Um, the Bible tells us why that is, right? The song is right, right? The song is hitting on something true, and I can tell you what the Bible gives as the explanation and the answer for that, right? Why we're lonely. We were made for fellowship with God. Why the world is broken? Because we've sinned against God and turned our back on our Creator, and it's messed everything up. We were made in God's image, made to know God, made to reflect God's glory. We are made for a great purpose. But as long as we are have our backs to God, we're never going to experience what we were made for, right? So we can start with things that people already resonate with and they know, and then show how those things are true, and if they are true, should lead us to God Himself, right? So Paul does that here as he quotes these Greek writers. He says that in verse 29, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. So the last thing he quoted was, we are indeed his offspring. And Paul's saying that's true. And if it's true, then what are we doing with all these idols that we've crafted out of stone and gold and so forth? If we are God's offspring, we didn't come from stone. We didn't come from gold. If we were created by God, then God can't be like all these gods that you're worshiping, right? All these idols that you've crafted. That doesn't make any sense. So what Paul's doing here that we can also imitate is that he is gently pointing out some of the contradictions and inconsistencies in their own worldview, in their own way of thinking. On the one hand, you've got poets saying, we're God's offspring, or, in God we live and move and have our being. Now, on the other hand, you've got so-called gods that are actually made by men out of stone and metal and things like that. And those things can't both be true. And so we can show where the inconsistencies are, where things don't line up, and then use that as a transition, as a segue into, can I tell you the truth about God? Which is what Paul does next. He talks about God, righteousness, judgment, the resurrection of Jesus, things like that, and calls upon them to repent. So that's just sort of a quick overview of some of what Paul is doing in Acts 17. And we're going to come kind of back to it full circle by the end, I hope. But the next question that might come up in our minds as we're thinking about this is, okay, well, Paul is reasoning with them about what God is like, but they're already worshiping some kind of God. Did they already know that there was a God? Why, if so, why were they worshiping the wrong gods? Things like that. What does the Bible have to say about people knowing God, even if they don't have the Bible? Well, the Bible's really clear about people knowing God, even if they don't have the Bible. So in Romans 1:18 and 19 and 20, it says something like, for the righteousness of God, or should be the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. All right, what truth are they suppressing? It goes on to say that for ever since the creation of the world, that God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived from the beginning of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. In other words, the truth they're suppressing about God, or the truth they're suppressing by their unrighteousness is the truth about God, that God exists and God has made that known to everyone through his creation, through the things he's made from the beginning, from the time of creation till now. The creation itself has been telling us that there is a God, there is a creator, there is one who is mighty and good and wise and powerful, who has made all the things that we see, who's made us. And so Paul says no one has an excuse for failing to worship and give thanks to God, because everyone knows that God is there. Nobody's going to stand before God at the end and say, be able to say, I would have worshipped you, but I didn't know you were there. I would have given thanks to you, but I didn't know you existed. Paul says that's not an excuse, because they do know. Psalm 19 says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. The creation itself, in other words, is preaching to us all the time, proclaiming to us that there is a creator. We call that natural revelation because God has revealed himself through nature. We also call it general revelation because God has revealed himself to all people in general, in all places, all times. You don't need a Bible or a church or a Christian friend to tell you these things. You just need to live in the world, right? You just need to see the creation. That revelation is everywhere. God also reveals himself through providence. Providence is a word that just means the way God governs and cares for his creation. So there's an episode, for example, in Acts 14, 15 to 17, where Paul is speaking to some pagans. I think they're trying to worship maybe him and Barnabas because of something that's happened, and Paul's trying to stop them. And one of the things he says to them is he tells them about the true God, right? He says, we're just men like you. He tells them about the true God, and he says that God, now overlooks the times of ignorance before, but even then, God didn't leave himself without a witness, but gave them, fruitful harvests and rains and things like that. I'm paraphrasing. It's something along those lines. And so he's saying, God has been bearing witness to you that he's there, that he cares for you in the ways that he's provided for you through, again, rain, harvest, all those kinds of things. So God shows himself through providence. God shows himself through creation. But the kicker is, what do people do with that knowledge? Right? If the Bible's saying everyone knows there's a God, then why are there atheists? Why are there people who say they don't believe in God? Why are there people who say they don't know if there's a God? Agnostics who are, kind of, they're not saying we know for sure there's not a God like an atheist. They're more like, well, I don't know and I can't know, right, perhaps. So what is going on there? Well, again, remember Romans 1:18 says that people suppress the truth about God. They know the truth about God, but they suppress it. They don't want to know it. They don't want to believe it. And this is true of humanity across the board because of our sinful nature, right? Because of Adam and Eve's sin, we all inherit a sin nature, and we all are born into a state of sin and rebellion against God. Also, Romans 1 goes on to say in verses 21 to 23 that part of how people respond to the knowledge of God the Creator is that instead of worshiping the Creator, they worship the creation. They worship idols. They worship images of animals and birds and men and things like that. They'll worship the creation, but not the Creator. So they suppress the truth. Romans 1 says they exchange the glory of God for these other things. Another thing that people do in response to the knowledge that we all have that there is a God is we try to tell ourselves that it's not true. So in Psalm 14, verse 1, it says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." Now, I used to read that or think about that in terms of someone like, someone who's an atheist who's telling people there is no God. But that's not what the verse says. The verse says that this person is telling himself. He's saying in his heart, there is no God. And why is he doing that? This came together for me. I don't know if I was studying Psalm 14, reading a commentary or a apologetic book or something. But anyway, I think something pointed this out. Um, that instead he's telling himself there is no God, and the reason why is because he doesn't want there to be a God, because if there is a God, then he's going to be accountable for all of his sin. If you go on to read Psalm 14 verse 2 and verse 3, it talks about the sinfulness of humanity and whatnot. um, this foolish person is telling themselves there is no God because they want to keep living in their sin without being afraid of having to face the judgment of God. That's what seems to be going on there. That's what people do as well. They say to themselves and to others sometimes, right, that there's not a God because they don't want there to be a God. So if people know there's a God, but they suppress that truth, they worship other things instead, they tell themselves that there is no God, why is it that we need proofs for the existence of God, arguments for God's existence? What are those for? What are we doing with them? What are we hoping to accomplish? And this is what brings us full circle, right? When Paul was at the Areopagus in Acts 17, when he told the Athenians about the unknown God, right, the true God, he wasn't telling them something they didn't know, in the sense that they did know there was a God. In fact, they worshiped all kinds of God. They'd had that Romans 1 response, right, where they were worshiping all kinds of created things or images of created things instead of the creator himself. And so what Paul is doing is he's arguing for why they should believe in the true God, who's not like the gods that they've invented for themselves. So one of the reasons why we have these arguments, these reasonings, these proofs for the existence of God is because some people try to tell themselves that God does not exist. And these arguments help us to do for them a couple of things. One, to show them how foolish it is to live like and think like and tell yourself that there's not a God, right? Remember it says in Psalm 41, the fool says in his heart there is no God. It is folly, it is foolish to try to convince yourself that there's not a God, because there is a God. And good arguments for the existence of God show how foolish that is, and help remove that folly. They also help to remove that false comfort that they're giving themselves by assuring themselves that there is no God. Well, since there's not a God, I won't have to give an account for this. I can live my life how I want. I can do what I want. Nobody sees, nobody knows, all that kind of stuff. That's a false comfort. It's not true. God sees and knows everything. We are going to have to give an account of ourselves to God. And so arguments for the existence of God help remove that false comfort, help show the folly of thinking and living like there is no God, because there is, in fact, a God. Another reason why we need these arguments is because some who know there's a God worship false gods, and they need to know what the true God is like. Again, this is what Paul does in Acts 17. He tells them, based on what your own poets have said, the gods can't be the way you are portraying them. They can't be like these idols crafted out of wood and metal and things like that. And instead, he doesn't need a temple. He doesn't need us to serve him, because he made everything. He made us. He doesn't need us. So we try to persuade people to worship the true God instead of the God of their imagination. And then the final reason I'll give for why we need these arguments for the existence of God, or proofs for the existence of God, is because even Christians can have doubts. Even Christians can go through seasons and circumstances where they're not sure. Maybe it doesn't feel like God is listening. It doesn't feel like God is there. How do I know he's there? How do I know that he's real and it's not just something I want to believe? All the things, all the arguments that people throw against the truth of the existence of God, how do we answer those when they kind of get their little hooks in our minds or in our hearts or our spirit, and we start to doubt and wonder and question? These proofs for the existence of God can help us to answer those and help build us up in our faith, help assure us of the truth about God. So, Lord willing, the next couple of weeks at least, we will begin to look at some of those proofs, some of those arguments for the existence of God that I hope will be helpful not only for you yourself, but also for others you may be seeking to win or seeking simply to encourage in the faith. God bless.